Today, I'm speaking with journalist and political commentator Michael Tracey. He has a long career in the media space. He's worked with the Young Turks and most recently System Update with Glenn Greenwald. He's also an independent journalist. You can find his work on his Substack at mtracy.net. Michael has done a great job covering domestic politics and foreign policy over the years. And most recently, he's been paying close attention to this apparent rift on the right with the MAGA base, those who are against war and those that are calling on Americans to blindly support Donald Trump, whatever he decides to do. So I want to hear from you now, Michael, and just give us a sense of what is taking place on the right. What are the conversations like? Is this rift real or not?
Yeah, so I think the supposed rift is drastically overstated. I think it's partially a function of a phenomenon that was more reminiscent of the online left in my experience in recent years, which is that people radically overinterpreted what they were seeing on prominent social media platforms as representative of the Democratic Party base writ large. So, for example, in 2020, Bernie Sanders supporters in the Democratic primaries skewed younger, skewed more actively online, and Joe Biden supporters in the Democratic primaries skewed older, skewed among demographics that were less naturally tethered to social media platforms and so forth. And so that kind of created a distorted picture of what the prevailing sentiments were if you're talking about the Democratic Party base in aggregate. And, activists and such are also overrepresented online, people with like media adjacency. And so that kind of sent a certain kind of feedback into the Democratic Party's sort of mainstream that distorted or skewed what the prevailing sentiments of their party's base were. And I think there's a similar dynamic going on now in the Republican Party where you have younger Republicans, younger Trump supporters who are followers of certain podcasts, active users of X, etc., projecting this notion that if a war with Iran is launched, that's going to be a huge betrayal of the quote unquote base. And how do you define what the Republican Party's base is? Is the Republican Party's base really primarily represented by whichever tweets get algorithmically prioritized on X? Probably not. That's probably not what the median Republican voter is best represented by. And so there was a poll in late May by Rasmussen, which is ordinarily seen as a pollster that's sympathetic to Republicans or even aligned with Republicans and maybe taken with a little bit of grain of salt from that respect. But they found that 75% of Trump 2024 voters would support a US strike on Iran. And the figure went up to 84% when you selected for voters who still express a strong preference for Trump or strong approval of Trump. And that was before, let's remember, Trump started publicly whipping up a kind of war frenzy.
Mm,
So, given that the overriding dynamic in the Republican Party is obviously loyalty to Trump or fealty to Trump, I
yeah.
think you would expect that dynamic to intensify further. And even among people who like Charlie Kirk, for example, he's somebody who's seen as a prominent influencer or a representative of the base or whatever. If you look carefully at what he's saying, yes, he does sound these notes of caution or skepticism about the prospect of quote regime change, wars, or what have you. But he's also simultaneously demanding that his audience,
Trust Trump.
yeah, uncritically place trust in Trump. So the government is literally mobilizing for war as we speak. Trump is rushing military assets to the Middle East. He already generated this whole situation to begin with, which we should get into, by contriving these supposed negotiations that ultimately served as the pretext for the initiation of the bombing campaign last week. And Charlie Kirk, who is, I guess, in the media, right? He does have like a podcast and he's a professional Republican activist. He's like joined to the hip with Trump, and some people in this demographic, I guess, listen to him and take his instructions or whatever. He's still calling for unwavering fidelity to Trump. Same with Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon has also expressed these notes of skepticism, and my understanding is he actually even met with Trump yesterday at the White House. But even he has said that look, I mean, we might not like it, but all us in the America First MAGA crowd are going to jump on board if it's decided by our commander in chief, who we've poured all this emotional political energy into supporting. If he decides that it's necessary to go to war with Iran, we're going to just support it. And so I think the rift is really overstated. I think, to the extent that like prominent quote unquote anti-establishment podcasters or whatever, I don't have any personal animosity toward a guy like Dave Smith. However, he and people in his cohort made a political decision in 2024 to endorse Donald Trump, to campaign for Donald Trump, to advocate that their followers vote for Donald Trump on the ground that Trump represented this vague, nebulous, anti establishment energy, that he was anti war, etc. And they would point to the campaign rhetoric of people like RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard, who I think are going to go down as a masterclass in the most obfuscatory, nonsensical campaign propaganda that maybe we've ever witnessed in recent American political history, anyway. Because on the one hand, you'd have RFK Jr. say stuff like, go look at his Madison Square Garden rally appearance in October of last year. He'll say stuff like, Trump is going to dismantle the military industrial complex, and he's going to end the warfare state. He's going to bring bring peace to the world. You and I talked about how these Muslim imams in Michigan, whom Trump was catering to, jumped on stage with him. You were apparently invited. Maybe you can talk more about this. Jumped on stage with him, echoed some of this rhetoric from the likes of Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr., and believed Trump when they heard these vague platitudes about how Trump was going to bring peace to the Middle East. Now, those are platitudes. Those have no policy specifics whatsoever. They're just these ambiguous aspirations and slogans and so forth.
It's almost as bad as Pete Buttigieg in the 2020 election when he was running against Joe Biden in the primaries, and he was just coming out with all these empty, vague, nebulous statements that meant nothing, but people were getting hyped over.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot more egregious in this respect. Simultaneously, as these comforting sounding platitudes were being promulgated, Trump and his surrogates and the people who would actually play a prominent policy role in his administration were openly declaring that they would support exactly what's going on right now.
Yeah.
Trump on numerous occasions said Biden is such a weakling because he's not enabling Israel to strike Iran's nuclear facilities. Israel should strike Iran's nuclear facilities. Trump came out and gave us campaign speech saying that he's going to threaten to blow Iran to, quote, smithereens, blow up the entire country, because they had supposedly threatened to assassinate him. That's another claim that he amplified. His CIA director, when he was still a private citizen, was publicly agitating for joint U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran on the ground that the pretext was already set up, as Iran had allegedly tried to assassinate Trump, which is still a total miasma of absurdity in terms of what constitutes that supposed claim, and also that Iran had tried to hack the Trump campaign emails, and therefore Trump should get revenge by launching joint U.S.-Israeli strikes against Iran. J.D. Vance, the first thing he basically said at the one vice presidential debate was to endorse a preemptive strike by Israel on Iran with full U.S. support. And what does it mean for the U.S. to support Israel launching a strike against Iran? It's not just sending out some words of commendation. Obviously, if you know anything about the U.S.-Israeli relationship, you know that Israel is an appendage of the United States militarily, in terms of intelligence sharing, in terms of every logistical step that would be required for Israel to wage such a campaign against Iran, which was going to be one of the most audacious in its entire history. So what, you think the U.S. is going to be a passive bystander or observer of that? Of course not. And J.D. Vance knew that, and he was signaling that, and anybody who had the slightest bit of foreknowledge or discernment ought to have understood the implications of what J.D. Vance was openly advocating, what Trump was openly advocating. But it was occluded by these simultaneous expressions of aspiration around Trump as this anti-war candidate, or ending endless wars was going to be his big priority, etc. But if you notice, that stuff was all in the realm of intangibility, slogans, nostrums. In terms of the tangible stuff, like supporting a preemptive strike by Israel on Iran, that was all out there in the open. But this media ecosystem, dominated by a lot of podcasters and people who don't sorry to say, have a journalistic sensibility at all, which is not what everybody needs to have. But like, it does endow you with a little bit more critical thinking than if you're just a partisan cheerleader. These podcasters created an atmosphere where it was seen as just commonsensical that Trump was going to have this war averse agenda, even as they were getting totally diametrically opposite information if they just had their eyes open and their ears open.
Right.
Um,
And more important than just the vague statements that were contradictory to the supposed claims of seeking peace, but you had actual actions to pay attention to. And Trump, the moment he got into office, he sold Israel more weapons. Uh, I mean, we were told Ukraine war would end, genocide would end. Instead of those two things coming to an end, we got a third war. So it's escalating, it's increasing. I want to push back a little bit, though. I do agree that definitely on social media, we're in a bubble. I learned that myself in 2016. I would have voted for Bernie Sanders. I have never in my life voted for a Democratic candidate. I've always voted third party. So in 2016, I considered voting for Bernie Sanders, but then obviously the party colluded against him. And I believed that there was going to be this major Dem exit and that the Green Party would get 5% because I was in this bubble. And then elections took place and Jill Stein didn't even get 1%. And I learned a very painful lesson at that time that I was in a social media bubble and you can't assume that who you're around and the algorithm, what it shows you, is a reflection of the majority of the population. That being said, though, in the lead up to the election, Trump did engage heavily with these podcast influencers and uh, and Charlie Kirk. Anytime he wants to tweet about Iran and this war, he polls. He posts a poll first because he wants to put his finger on the pulse and see how he should be discussing. We see Matt Walsh and the way he's kind of trying to play both sides. Tucker Carlson is not just a podcast I mean, he was on Fox News, so this is a massive personality with a massive following. And the older generation, while in 2016 and 2020 maybe spent less time on social media, even that has been changing. I meet old people all the time who only get their media from social media now. So and that's why there's been an infiltration. They're trying to like create uh, podcast influencers that come across as uh, independent, not mainstream, but actually they're serving the mainstream narrative. So, do you really believe the Rasmussen poll is more reflective? Do you think it's somewhere in the middle?
I don't believe that there's going to be a significant oppositional movement within the Republican Party to Donald Trump. I don't think that's how the Republican Party psyche works. I think that's much more likely to happen on the Democratic Party, however ineffectual it might be. Like there was a left wing, or like let's say more on the left than the right, rather than narrowing it to the Democratic Party or Republican Party. I think on the right is much more kind of instinctively hierarchical in terms of following the dictates or the authority of the leader, whereas on the left there's more likely to be at least some protest or some dissension. Again, even as ineffectual as it might be, there was a robust protest movement against Biden's policy in Israel, for instance. Could you imagine an equivalent of that happening on the right in terms of foreign policy? I can't. You'll have marginal outlier figures who are criticizing Trump, just as during his first term. I don't know if you recall, but like when Trump bombed Syria for the first time in April 2017, there were a handful of people who were associated with like the quote unquote alt right who were saying that this was a betrayal of America first. And some of them did some, haphazard protest efforts, and it went essentially nowhere because they're not representative of the primary tendency within the right wing movement or right wing disposition such as it exists.
For those engaged in the conversation, which the majority of the country is not engaged, they are distracted by entertainment and gambling and football and living and working and things like that. So they don't really care about this conversation. But for those that are engaged, I think we can see, the ratios on X. But it sounds like, you're correct in pointing out that this may not be reflective of the population as a whole. So you don't believe then that Trump is worried that making the wrong decision on a war with Iran could affect the midterms potentially?
I don't think Trump I mean, I always am a little bit hesitant to psychoanalyze Donald Trump or psychoanalyze Putin or psychoanalyze any world leader. I feel it's like an annoying genre of punditry. But I'm not sure Trump really cares all that much about the Republican Party's prospects writ large. Like, I don't think he's gonna be calculating what he does right now in anticipation of what might happen in the midterms in a year and a half. I don't even think it's clear that to stoke a war fervor would work against his political interests. Like, historically, when a war is launched, it produces a quote unquote rally around the flag effect
Mm,
and bolsters support for the leader
yeah.
because uncritical allegiance is demanded in the midst of wartime. So, um, and also by historical patterns, Trump would be or the Republicans would be favored to lose seats in the 2026 midterms anyway, because that's what most commonly happens with the party that controls the presidency. So I just think that it's too sort of tenuous of a calculation to have front of mind in terms of how to handle the current situation. And I think when Trump, posts America first means Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, I think most people are going to buy that with the exception of the tiny minority of people who as you mentioned, are like very actively engaged in the daily conversation and debate who have the bandwidth to dissect that claim with a little bit more rigor.
Right.
By and large, the people who are just like receiving signals as they go about their ordinary lives and they're just kind of instinctive baseline Trump supporters are going to, I don't think, have much of a problem reconciling that, especially because Iran is going to be claimed to be, this Islamic terror regime. And it's not that hard to convince uh, right wing people historically that they should be really fearful and angry at Islamic terrorists. That's all they really need to know.
Yeah, and there are videos of entire crowds in Iran chanting, "Death to
Yeah.
America." So it's not going to be too hard for them to plaster that on Fox News and just. But fewer and fewer people are watching Fox News and CNN, right? So I, I s- I'm definitely in agreement with you. I'm always cautious to think that, okay, what I'm seeing on my algorithm is reflective of the entire population. But when you see guys like Tucker Carlson grilling Ted Cruz, I mean, that was a massive interview. What did you make of that exchange, and how do you factor that into
Yeah, I
your
mean, I think
interview?
it was a great interview. One of Tucker's best. I actually hope that he continues using his independent platform for more stuff exactly like that because I don't know. I don't think I need to see like a 90-minute conversation with Cat Turd or other like social media
Yeah,
personalities so much as actually doing a proper adversarial interrogative interview with a powerful politician who's willing
right.
to give like a long time to probe at length. So yeah, that was just a very high quality interview. However, I will note that if you noticed, Tucker still goes to great lengths to say how much he loves Trump, how
Yeah,
he's fundamentally a supporter of Trump, he campaigned for Trump. So, and even when Ted Cruz tries to like introduce a wedge between Tucker and Trump by saying, "Look, Trump says Iran tried to assassinate him. You don't believe him, or Trump has always said that Iran can't have a nuclear weapon, et cetera, et cetera." So to try to set up the dynamic whereby Tucker has to argue more expressly against Trump rather than these abstract, phantom, sort of nefarious influences that are perpetually surrounding Trump and leading him astray or forcing his hand or what have you. It's always the malevolent neocons who are conniving in the background, not Trump as the primary agent of responsibility, right? Tucker can't really take the bait. He still says, "Yeah, of course I love Trump." So I just think that since to remain in good standing in the right wing ecosystem, particularly if you ever want to run for elected office, if you want to win a Republican primary, if you want to retain your audience in Trump adjacent media spheres, if you want to have any hope of like advancing through the Republican professional class, you cannot directly come out and oppose Trump. Because
mm,
as mildly as Tucker maybe criticized Trump a few days prior, where he didn't really, but it was like presented to Trump as evidence of Tucker attacking him by saying that Trump was quote complicit in the bombing campaign, which is an understatement. That still led to Trump publicly posting that Tucker was a kook. Um,
yeah,
so it's always this the tight tight wire act or tightrope act that people have to walk, where they're constantly obfuscating or deflecting from the man at the top or the primary agent of responsibility and casting blame on other nefarious actors who are
Yeah.
in his circle. And I think, one of the rare things that Trump really has been consistent on for the entire time that he's been in the public eye as a political figure is this fixation with Iran. In his first term, he drastically intensified bellicosity against Iran and deteriorated relations with Iran, like by design. He campaigned saying he would do that. He withdrew from the JCPOA. He
He killed
imp-
Qasem Soleimani.
yeah, he imposed this policy of maximum pressure on Iran, which is the most crippling sanctions available in the U.S. arsenal, with the aim of destabilizing the government and creating the conditions to the extent that the U.S. can for regime change. He drone strike. Yeah, he drone assassinated the top Iranian general. He actually resurrected the architecture of the Iraq War. So in January of 2020, when the drone strike assassination of Soleimani happened, the administration tried to claim that this was legally authorized by the 2002 authorization for use of force in Iraq. That was the legal predicate for the invasion of Iraq to topple Saddam Hussein, because Soleimani was physically present inside Iraq when the assassination
Yeah, and
happened.
he also lied. I guess they had lured him to Iraq to negotiate or something of that
Yeah,
nature.
Soleimani was on a diplomatic mission at the time,
Yeah.
and he was assassinated in his car by a drone strike. Um, Trump, when he was president the first time, would egg on like whatever protest movement in Iran might have bubbled up and like pledge US support for it, because the Republicans were generally resentful that in 2009 Obama didn't vigorously support the Green movement at the time, which was a protest movement that sprung up after an Iranian election that was disputed. And so all of this was like incredibly telegraphed. Like Trump did instituted a hugely bellicose and antagonistic policy toward Iran in his first term. Actually, in June of 2019, he said that he was within 10 minutes of authorizing a U.S. bombing campaign against Iran because an unmanned drone was shot down over the Persian Gulf, an unmanned U.S. drone, and then he pulled back at the last minute.
Yeah.
So this is like always been the knife's edge we've been on with Trump and Iran. Yeah, when he withdrew from the JCPOA, go listen to his speech at the time. He was saying that if we maintain the JCPOA, this existential threat of a nuclear Iran would be such that American cities would be on the verge of destruction, because Iran would be secretly, furtively violating the agreement and obtaining a nuclear weapon and getting ready to like nuke New York and Los Angeles. And that's the same rhetoric that they're using now. And then in the 2024 campaign, Trump pledged to accelerate the bellicosity against Iran even further. So I get annoyed or frustrated with these right wing people who are like trying to claim that they're leading the charge for some kind of anti war resistance. They were all cheerleaders for the candidate who was openly telegraphing and pledging he was going to do this, but they chose to willfully self-deceive, or they just didn't care. I mean, I don't know. There's some kind of mass psychology phenomenon going on there
Yeah.
that caused them to
Well, I've
present
noticed
this
that.
totally fatally flawed like depiction of what Trump was pledging.
Yeah. I've noticed that people delude themselves into this belief and this perception. They see what they focus on and they believe what they focus on. So they want to believe that Trump is going to be America first. They want to believe that America, isn't what what it obviously is, right? This empire, uh, at home and abroad. Um, they want to believe that he's going to end these wars, but as you've pointed out in extreme detail, Trump is a hypocrite. He does the exact opposite of everything he claims he says he's going to do. And I think, right now though, I get why people like Tucker and others are saying, look, I'm not against Trump. It's because they're competing, for the base of those who aren't really involved in the conversation and they just love and support Trump. Max Blumenthal and I were just at the military parade in DC this weekend, and we interviewed people who were there to support the parade. And a lot of them were there just to support Trump. And Max asked one person, he said, are you here to, like, why do you support Trump? And the guy's daughter got involved in the conversation. She interrupted and she said, it's not us supporting Trump. We support America. So they view Trump and America as like intertwined. If you support America, you have to support Trump. And so if you're criticizing this potential war, then you're actually criticizing America as a whole. And so this is the kind of people they're dealing with. And so I understand why they're trying to say, look, I don't dislike Trump. I just dislike this policy of going to war. And it's not actually him, it's those around him. So I get why the
Yeah,
conversation manifests itself.
I get the logic from the standpoint of like politically maneuvering. I just think at a certain point it becomes
Yeah, you got
an
to call it spade a
untruthful
spade.
portrayal of what's going on. Like if your
Yeah.
primary duty is like journalistic or truth telling or something, and you're constantly couching or qualifying every description that you're making of ongoing political events, especially when they're of the magnitude of what's going on right now, then I think that's something of a disservice because it's presenting an inaccurate picture of the dynamics at play that are now on the verge of, or it's a which are now embroiling us in a cataclysm.
What do you think happens next? Do you believe that Trump will actually strike Iran? Will it be as destructive as people claim?
Let's go back and just briefly review this whole supposed negotiating exercise that Trump instituted when he came into office with respect to Iran, right?
Mhm.
His position was that his publicly stated position was that Iran can't have a nuclear weapon and he would prefer to do it the easy way rather than the hard way, meaning he would prefer to have some ill-defined diplomatic resolution rather than have to deploy a military option. And he delegated the task of negotiating with Iran to Steve Witkoff, who's this all-purpose envoy who seems a tad overstretched if his portfolios include everything from Russia, Ukraine to Iran to Israel, Hamas, etc. But that was who was given to Steve Witkoff, although he's not like a lifelong public-facing ideologue. Everything that you can examine from his history shows that he's hardcore pro-Israel. He attends pro-Israel galas and fundraisers and gives money, etc. You know, basically the standard sensibility you'd expect of somebody like of his archetype. And so he's put in charge of these Iran negotiations. And very soon, Witkoff begins to declare that the only tolerable settlement, diplomatic settlement from the US standpoint, would be for Iran to agree to totally cease all enrichment of uranium and effectively dismantle its nuclear facilities, which, if you follow this issue for any length of time, you'll know would be perceived by Iran as essentially them accepting and willfully self-inflicting like a giant national humiliation, basically agreeing to uh, abolish a huge source of national pride at the dictate of this far off imperial power as they see it, who's just coming and trying to demand or impose on them how to run their society or provide for their collective defense. So that became the U.S. position, publicly stated. That was perfectly in alignment with the Israeli position. Netanyahu said that he and Trump had met right before these supposed negotiations were launched, and they agreed that in order for any successful diplomatic outcome to be achieved, Iran would have to agree to allow the U.S. to blow up its nuclear facilities, which is not a diplomatic endpoint or is not a way to structure legitimate negotiations in a way that could allow for a rational, nonviolent outcome. So I think
So the negotiations were doomed from the beginning.
They were doomed by how they were structured. If they're doomed
Yeah,
by a demand that Iran accede to something that they're never going to accede to, and that's known that they're never going to accede to it, then yeah, they're kind of. I think it's fair to infer that they were a ruse for, on the one hand, allowing Trump to, in the meantime, furnish Israel with armaments, which they did, uh, with for the purpose of continuing the annihilation campaign in Gaza, but also preparing for the Iran campaign, evidently, and also giving like a justificatory pretext for when the uh, campaign against Iran was launched. And Trump came out and said this directly. I gave them 60 days. I gave them a 60-day ultimatum where,
yeah,
in order to avoid getting bombed, they would have to agree to something that they were never going to agree to, and that justifies doing this. So, what's going to
right.
happen in the future? They're still doing, seemingly, as of today, this pantomime of negotiations. Like, you have certain Republicans, and this gets back to what we were talking about before, even people like a Marjorie Taylor Greene, who are coming out and publicly saying stuff that would seem to suggest to you that they're going to oppose a war, right? They're saying, none of my constituents want another war in the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. Like, we shouldn't do this for Israel, going much further than like the median Republican member of Congress would go. Even she is saying, I'm so grateful to Donald Trump for always putting peace first.
Yeah.
As if this whole
As if none of this is happening.
as if
Yeah,
this whole disaster wasn't orchestrated by
yeah,
Trump. So they're
yeah.
still like in this. That's why I'm saying, like, to constantly having to frame everything where you're absolving Trump of responsibility, I think limits the potency of any right wing or Republican opposition that might emerge here. They're like they're already like they're preemptively neutering themselves of any efficacy because they're not using any leverage. The sole example anywhere is always just Thomas Massey, who actually has introduced a war powers resolution to constrain Trump's war making powers. If you Marjorie Taylor Greene is not co-sponsoring that resolution.
In fact, no one is. If I'm
No
uh,
Republican is. There's like 17 Democrats, I think.
yeah. What a sad state of affairs. You know, there's evidence that the IAEA, during the negotiations, their inspectors were, I guess, visiting Iran and meeting with them, and they were collecting intelligence not only about the facilities, but about who the scientists were, and then they would find out where they live, and then that information was fed to Israel, and that was used basically to assassinate them when they had this blitzkrieg attack on Iran last week. And so it seems like the negotiations were not only a ruse to buy time to give Israel, the weapons they need and the intel they need to plan their attack and provide a justification, a narrative that, well, look, we tried negotiating and Iran is just too hard headed to agree.
Yeah, they're
But
actually telling Iran, come back to the negotiating table.
yeah, or you need to come back, as if they left in the
Yeah.
first place, when they were literally prepared to meet on Sunday, but the day prior or 2 days prior, Israel attacked them. So, but it seems like the negotiations also, um, Witkoff was meeting with the Mossad before and after the
Yeah.
meetings with Iran. Like, that
Yeah,
is
and
not.
Ron Dermer, who's the top political guy advisor to Netanyahu. So it was all obviously coordinated with Israel.
Yeah, yeah. So this has been a ruse from the very beginning. I'm not optimistic whatsoever. I think this war will take place anyway. And what I'm very afraid of is if the war takes place and it's actually very successful for Israel um, in the United States. So if they are able to produce regime collapse, and it's just taking place over the air and it isn't U.S. troops who are in the line of fire, like right now, the U.S. is not only moving assets to the region, they're moving people out, and they've been like emptying the bases in the region. One, in order to prevent Iran from having any necessity to attack the Gulf, which is really the only deterrent they have. Like, if they don't attack the bases or the oil infrastructure, they have nothing. They can't do anything to discourage the U.S. from attacking them. So they're moving their personnel from the embassies and the bases, and they're bringing these aerial refuelers so that the aircraft carriers don't need to be anywhere near Iran so that they can't strike them. So the U.S. is trying to do this in a way where they take as little damage as possible. And if they succeed, then they're going to make all these MAGA influencers who are criticizing them look like fools, because they're saying that Americans are going to die and this is going to be really catastrophic. If this is really successful and it isn't anywhere near as damaging because Iran just tactically doesn't do a good job of producing deterrence, then it's going to be an incentive for more war. Just blindly
Yeah.
trust Trump whenever he tries to get into these
Well,
kinds of situations.
they're setting up a benchmark where if there are not large scale deployments of U.S. ground troops to Iran, and yet Trump still does accomplish some mission militarily, then that's a win for America first, because we're avoiding the Iraq War, as if the Iraq War is the standard by which we need to eternally judge the wisdom
War,
or
right?
efficacy of any subsequent American military action. And in a certain way, it becomes like a lazy sort of scapegoat or deflection. Not that people should
Yeah, it's
withhold
like
their
how
critiques of
Democrats
Iraq.
would say Obama ended war. Obama's, reign was one of the most peaceful, even though he had escalated war and spread it across the region. He had bombed like more countries than like any other US president all at once. But because you didn't see US troops and Humvees driving through the desert in the Middle East, people just assumed that we weren't at
Yeah,
war.
it's not George W. Bush invading and occupying Iraq for 8 years or whatever. But so therefore, it's in accordance with our America First foreign policy. That means it was really smart for Trump to demand unconditional surrender of the Iranian government, which is the same thing that was demanded by Franklin Roosevelt in 1943 of Japan and Germany in the midst of World War II. So that's the sentiment that Trump is echoing back to. I don't know if he's familiar with the World War II era history, but he found that term, or somebody fed him that term somehow, right? Who must have some familiarity with its etymology. And obviously, if you're invoking like a World War II era maximalist demand for unconditional surrender, then that's going to evoke images of like you have to extirpate the entire German state, which is what happened, or you have to drop
Right.
2 atomic bombs on Japan in order to achieve that. Etc. Or like threatening to kill the Ayatollah open, like he's like, we know where you are.
Yeah,
We could
yeah,
kill you right now, but we don't
yeah.
necessarily. Ordering mass evacuations of the entire capital city of Iran.
But Michael,
Really?
Trump is the peace president.
Yeah.
He's the
So
steady hand.
so yeah, you're right in that he'll have done all that. Maybe he'll authorize this large scale bombing campaign, which actually Seymour Hersh wrote yesterday, is already in the works for this weekend. Could be tonight. Don't Who knows?
Yeah.
Um,
I think it will be any moment now.
I think that's what's being telegraphed, but who knows? But this is not like the minor thing that Trump authorized, was on the verge of authorizing in June 2019. This is a huge mobilization of military assets from across the world. They're bringing like uh, carrier strike groups over from East Asia,
Yeah.
etc., and tanker refuelers are flying from all over the place to be pre-positioned. So I don't know. It seems like if they don't go for it, then people should ask, how much did it cost to do that elaborate bluff that didn't actually amount to anything? Because maybe
Yeah.
the remnants of Doge should investigate how much waste, fraud, and abuse went into that expenditure.
Right.
Um, but yeah, you're right in that this idea to trust Trump, they're going to frame it as a victory for America First foreign policy and putting America first if it simply just doesn't allow result in a 10-year occupation, which it may not be. I mean, if you're collapsing, okay, so Israel says that they're looking to do regime change. Like they're not even hiding it anymore. The defense minister said yesterday that Khamenei can no longer exist, meaning that they're going to be vaporizing him. You would think. Um, you don't necessarily have to occupy the entire country to spread democracy if you just collapse and destroy it. You could just
Right.
collapse and destroy it and then leave and let the chaos
Which is
fester.
what Israel wants. It
Yeah,
doesn't, yeah, it's not regime change, it's regime collapse. And
yeah,
even if they don't collapse the regime, they're weakening Iran regardless. And that's what Israel cares about anyway. Israel wants to secure their hegemony. and they're operating in the shade of the U.S. empire, getting whatever they can to expand their influence and control of the region. And they're the only nation in the region that has nuclear weapons, which, by the way, Trump doesn't seem to care about. Nobody cares about in the political class, in the power structures. The IAEA doesn't care. They're collaborating with Israel to feed them intelligence about Iran's nuclear program, so Israel can undermine it. So yeah, this is all unfortunate. I am expecting the worst, to be completely honest with you. I think Netanyahu's been telegraphing this. In a way, he's more in control of the situation than Trump is. You know, him and his forces are kind of guiding Trump where they want. And he has said for the last 2 years, we're going to reshape the Middle East. And I know for a fact he did not jump into this war just to save his political career. I think this is an Israeli war, not a Netanyahu one. And they knew that Iran's capabilities were powerful, and they knew that they had limited interceptors. But he said
Well,
he gave a 2 week time frame. It's been 1 week, and now the U.S. is about to come in for the second half, and I think they're going to do something big. I think we might witness one of the biggest um, airstrikes in world history. I think we're going to see hundreds of jets operating at the same time to just decimate Iran's infrastructure all at one time.
yeah, I mean, I would also just emphasize that it's an American war. I think there's a tendency to kind of say, "Oh, look, Israel's controlling our foreign policy again. The United States has no autonomy anymore because everything is just dictated by Israel because they're blackmailing everybody or whatever." I think a lot of that really does miss the mark. Maybe that's a controversial statement to make. I do think that it's a function of American autonomy. They view Israel as a loyal appendage to project American power and to further enshrine or to bolster American hegemony in the region. And Trump is like on board with that project. Hence the close collaboration every step of the way with Netanyahu. I mean, there's not much that anybody can really do at this point. I don't think. People can feel free to tweet saying "I love Trump," yet I'm worried about regime change or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think whatever small contribution I can make at this point would probably be best aimed at just emphasizing how, if anybody feels that they've been betrayed or deceived, which I've been hearing a lot of in the past week, I think it's worth explaining to people in just concrete, irrefutable detail how, to the extent that they were deceived, that's a product of them, I guess, lacking the discernment to see how obviously and unambiguously all of this was telegraphed all the way through, not just for months, but even arguably years. And hopefully giving people some more capacity to critically analyze stuff like this in the future rather than just becoming like a partisan echo chamber where they're convinced that the Republican presidential nominee is going to dismantle the deep state or restrain Israel. I had a debate with this Infowars lackey guy. I mean, it was organized by Zero Hedge in September of last year, and it was about the presidential campaign in Israel, and this guy was seriously arguing that Trump was going to hinder hinder Netanyahu's like Greater Israel project, or in other words, his thesis was that Trump secretly loathed Israel and was going to put huge constraints on Israel. Meanwhile, Trump is running on the most fanatically pro-Israel campaign platform of any presidential nominee virtually ever. And that
Yeah.
came to fruition within like 2 weeks of his term when he all of a sudden comes out with Netanyahu in the White House and says, "Oh, gee, by the way, the U.S. is going to be taking over Gaza and turning it into a U.S. military protectorate."
Yeah.
And then they systematically undermined the ceasefire that everybody was supposed to hail Trump and Witkoff for implementing. They greenlight the resumption of the end stage, like apocalyptic annihilation offensive in Gaza, and now we're getting a war with Iran. And I think that's a byproduct not of some necessarily nefarious influence that Trump is just being beguiled by, but because of what he very openly telegraphed and campaigned on his position being, his convictions being, and it's a continuation of what he did in his first term. So it was there for all to see. And if you got quote unquote deceived or snookered or whatever, then I think it's an occasion to reflect on what kind of polluted information and political environment you were living in that gave you this radically false impression.
That's an excellent point. I think that, and that will happen for a significant amount of people, not the majority, obviously, but they're going to gain more media and political literacy. And just, there's a simple rule: don't trust anything, period. You're always being lied to. And it's time to acknowledge that anything coming from media. I think one thing that I've learned that I was kind of naive about and new to, just how they deliberately leak things. Like you're being, oh my god, in the beginning when Biden, you got tough with Netanyahu on the phone, or Trump, there's a rift between Trump and
Yeah.
Netanyahu. I didn't fall for that, but I did kind of wonder, like, is this real? Like, how could I even believe that? Who would leak that and why? It's obvious that they use leaks and unnamed sources to just create narratives and perceptions and distract people, without anyone having to take responsibility for making that claim. So,
Yeah, and you have to develop media literacy. There's no, like, single formula for how to do it. I found the idea that there was this supposed rift between Trump and Netanyahu totally absurd from the outset, because how is that supposed rift manifesting in terms of policy? Trump was expediting heavy munitions to Israel. They colluded to undermine the supposed ceasefire that lasted until mid-March and then greenlit the resumption of the campaign in Gaza. Uh,
yeah, it's
Trump,
funny,
Trump, Trump, Trump and
you're
Wickoff.
you're
Yeah, Trump.
pointing to actions that actually matter, but
Yeah,
on the flip side, people who do believe that there's a rift will point to a stupid clip where Trump shakes Netanyahu's hand, and they're like, "Look
yeah,
how he's
yeah,
shaking his hand."
yeah.
Yeah,
So if you're, I always try to be more tethered to the tangible policy outcomes and then extrapolate from that. So for one thing, Witkoff, based on all the reporting that's come out from Dropsite and others, basically swindled Hamas by
yeah,
saying if you release the last remaining American Israeli captive, Elon Alexander, Trump will come out and publicly call for a ceasefire in Gaza. It didn't happen. I guess was just a lie. And and yet at the same time, we were being told that there was this giant rift between Trump and Netanyahu. Like, based on what? Like, how is that manifesting itself in terms of what tangibly is going on right now in the real world? Not at all.
yeah.
And so I think if people are more
They need to be
attached
more
to that as
skeptical.
like a heuristic,
Mm.
they'll be less likely to fall for these confabulated narratives.
Yeah, people need to be more skeptical, trust nothing, everything's
But you say trust
propaganda.
nothing, but like when JD Vance, as his first statement at the vice presidential debate, says, yes, explicitly, we support Israel launching a preemptive strike on Iran and the US must support it. Like, I trust that that's a
Yeah,
real
trust that,
reflection,
yeah.
yeah, of what
Trust nothing,
they're
but trust
actually going to
that.
do, right? So I mean, so you have
Yeah,
to kind of, trust but verify, or trust using some critical thinking
yeah.
that is best,
Well, it's a
the
number of
most.
things, right? Yeah, it's like, because Vance could have said, "We're going to improve healthcare." Okay, well, let's match that with who funds you and who backs you and what you've done in the past. And so when he opens up with that statement about Iran, you compare that to how much money he's taken for the military industrial complex, his relationship with Palantir, this war tech, death tech company, and all kinds of other things. And it's like, yeah, okay, I trust that. But when he says, when Trump says we'll make peace, just consider the fact that he created the situation by pulling out the JCPOA, as you pointed out. But Michael, I got to get going. I
Okay.
really appreciate you. I really
I can go
appreciate.
on forever. You got to reel me
I
back in
know, I
sometimes.
know. No, this is great, but I have another interview coming up in a bit. But I really
Okay.
appreciate you taking the time with us today. mtracy.net. Check out his Substack. Follow him on X. I'm putting it here on the screen when I edit this and get it uploaded. But really appreciate you, and hopefully we can get you back on. We'd love to, hear your thoughts as this continues to move forward. And I think by next week we're going to be in a completely different situation, and we're going to need your analysis on that. So thank you for being here, and talk soon.
Trust nothing. No